This will be, if you include my so far the first and only visit to China exactly 10 years ago, this will be the third time I'll be taking part in South-South Forum, because I also took part in last year's online conference as well. Thank you for the invitation. What I intend to do actually is to put basically the, if you like, debate about the future of capitalism as it has been the characteristic feature of the last nearly 18 months now, with the calamity of COVID-19 dawning upon humanity. In fact, a new round of what I call speculative debates about the future of capitalism at different scales of analysis, from the global to the supranational and or to the nation state, has been with us for quite some time now. And in that sense, there's an element of déjà vu in these debates, because in many ways they are reminiscent of those that had been expressed in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, which was, if you could recall, had been hailed as the greatest crisis of global capitalism since the 1930s, but also diagnosed as requiring the return of the state as the lender of last resort, thus marking the end of the sort of free market capitalism, as interestingly then by two important intellectuals from different traditions, Eric Hobsbawm on the one hand and Martin Wolf on the other. By the same token, as it happened again in the wake of 2008 crisis, there are currently a panoply of fortune-telling, ranging from the slow death of neoliberalism to deglobalization, which purport to provide a new set of foresights about the post-pandemic era characteristics of capitalism. In this regard, I would like to remind our audience about a prophecy-like statement made in the wake of the 2008 crisis by a columnist in the Financial Times that, as he put it, the only way to put the genie of financialization back in the bottle may require, quote, a pandemic. To the extent that the concept of financialization has been employed as a tool of periodization, that is, as a signifier of an epoch of capitalism, this would imply, to quote from Giovanni Arrighi, the end of a particular cycle of accumulation on a world scale via financial expansion. Interestingly, a decade later, at the beginning of the pandemic, an editorial in Financial Times reckoned that, quote, radical reforms reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table. That is to say, to cope with the economic and social repercussions of the pandemic. Whether or not such a policy reversal is to be realized, the verdict, which is quite widely shared, seems to be that the crisis through which we are living is a turning point in history. I think these comments and remarks gain significance since the pandemic-initiated crisis is essentially a crisis of social reproduction, which has been governed by financialization under neoliberalism. Put differently, the question arises whether the current crisis could pave the way for the emergence of a new regime of social reproduction by putting an end to the commodified market-based regime of social reproduction characteristic of the neoliberal era. While these kinds of analysis might be taken for a glimpse of optimism, there are also those which ring the alarm bells for the specter of authoritarian capitalism that is said to be haunting the West, in particular, the world in general. Curiously, both sets of arguments tend to share an underlying assumption about the changing nature of the relationship between the state and the market on the basis of immediate policy measures taken by several governments in the wake of the pandemic's impact on respective economies. Now, having set, if you like, the parameters which I will be briefly talking about the specific case of Turkey in a broader framework of the developments in Europe. Let me start by a comment made in the New Yorker, where Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan stated that, quote, Turkey is a country where production must continue and the cogs must keep turning under every circumstance and every condition. This was a statement made at the beginning of the pandemic. And in a sense, this is a theme that he will be pursuing, because at the beginning of this year, he would argue that the pandemic, along with difficulties and deprivation and problems that it had created for the business community, it is at the same time opening new windows of opportunity, especially for the Turkish firms, which would be, in a sense, making best of their capacity to enhance their competitiveness. In a sense, this rings a bell with a more general argument about the crisis at the time of the 2008 crisis made by several economists, and which could be summed up with this notion of crisis as an opportunity not to be missed. And this notion of crisis as an opportunity not to be missed is something which, how shall I say, is revolving around currently over the last 18 months or so as part of the debates about the future of capitalism. And in that respect, what the Turkish state did, especially given its very authoritarian regime as a legacy of the last 4 decades, but especially coming to the fore very clearly over the last 3-4 years with the new constitutional amendments made in the wake of the abortive coup attempt in, exactly 5 years ago, that it became the, if you like, the stimulus of the Turkish state that non-essential business shouldn't stop, while sort of restaurants and so, along with education institutions, schools of every levels would be closed, but working people have to go to work every day. Yet, from the very beginning, if you like, the medical people from the academic world and outside was underlining the point that because of the people going to work regularly would be, in a sense, will be the, how shall I say, the functioning as the transmission mechanisms for the virus, especially in the Turkish context, when 65-year-olds and their elders will be imprisoned in their houses. We had a rather our own version of lockdowns only for the elderly, and to be added in due course for the youth under 20 or 18. They keep changing the barriers, but generally speaking, as it turned out to be, that in fact the working people will be the transmitters of the virus as the number of cases multiplied over time. And in that respect, what happened was also interesting, because I think it was more or less the summer of last year, when the Turkish state ceased producing daily number of cases and instead start announcing the number of ill, which meant a very considerably a low figure. And it continued like that for about, I don't know, 3-4 months. But before the end of 2020, they went back and then producing the number of cases on a daily basis. But generally speaking, the trust of the people in the statistics and published were increasingly, how shall I say, declining. And there will be sort of speculation about the real figures in terms of number of people who passed away as well as the number of cases treated. So generally speaking, there was this case where the president, which personified the state, as he called it, my state, resisted any attempt to put into effect a real lockdown, as it had been the case in several European countries over the last year or so. And it was, interestingly, created a situation in which the Turkish economy, having faced the pandemic after more than 2 years of economic crisis. And in a sense, I think the best summary had been provided a very recent IMF Article 4 consultation on Turkey published earlier this month, where I will simply read a few sentences. Quote, in the years leading up to the COVID pandemic, growth in Turkey became increasingly dependent on externally funded credit and demand stimulus. This growth was accompanied by large current account deficits, financed mainly by debt, which led in turn to high external financing needs. At the same time, rapid credit growth, led by state-owned banks and high inflation, undermined monetary policy credibility and fueled deposit dollarization. The resulting pressure on the lira contributed to large reserve losses. As a result, Turkey entered the pandemic with lower buffers than most peers. This will be subsequently and previously will be described either as credit-driven growth model or credit-led accumulation model, duly to be criticized by both the critical economists as well as by the representatives of the international financial markets. So the government as such was attempting to pursue this line, notwithstanding criticisms from within the country as well as from without. So, in a sense, the administration, Turkish government, attempted to reassure the international financial community by prescribing austerity, as it had done so in the context of the crisis of 2018 and 19. But rather than providing any social support for the needy, it tended to rely on the public banks to expand credit. And a variety of so-called ingenious mechanisms had been put into effect, such as active ratio regulation, which attempted to put pressure upon the private sector banks to join the credit expansion, while avoiding at the time and until present any resort to the adoption of an IMF standby agreement. So this, in a sense, tended to be criticisms which would tend to describe the, how shall I say, the shift of the pendulum between different policy measures, which also witnessed change of the governor of the Turkish Central Bank quite rapidly, over the last few years, to be described by the critical observers of the Turkish economy as the crisis of crisis management itself. So, when you look at the sort of response to the COVID in terms of its social support mechanisms, that it was a political decision, if you like, to use the terminology of state theorizing. The strategic selectivities of the Turkish state was such that it will increase the indebtedness of both the corporate sector as well as the households. So, according to the IMF report I just mentioned, quote, Turkish policymakers preferred to manage the economic slump by extending new credits to the small and medium enterprises and making workers and low-income households borrow more. So we could, in a sense, put it in a broader framework in the European context, and especially in reference to the British case, where the notion of furlough was introduced at the very beginning of the pandemic in March 2020 by the Johnson government, described by its chancellor as unprecedented measures for unprecedented times, where the state would pay grants covering up to the 80% of the salary of workers if companies kept them on their payroll rather than lay them off as the economy goes into a recession. And in that respect, there was no such equivalence in the Turkish context. And I could go into the details of the British and other European examples, but to make economize on time, I won't get it at this stage. But the point being that all this debate produced at the same time a revival of an old debate, which could be traced back to the 80s and 90s, in terms of the need for a new set of measures under the label of basic income schemes. That is to say, as a new mechanism or strategy of crisis management in lessening the economic insecurity of the people deprived of their standard of living. And in that sense, interestingly again, Financial Times editorial had been joining the bandwagon by stating that policies such as the basic income, which are, quote, until recently considered eccentric, will have to be taken on board. The political implications are also, I think, momentous, because the proponents of this universal basic income tended to portray it as an instrument of freedom, as it would transform the political relationship between labor and capital by partially decommodifying labor. In fact, they have underlined that a basic income should not be conceived in relation to employment, since ideally speaking, it should entail, quote, a truly universalistic entitlement without any work requirements. So notions such as democratizing work, etc., would be making the headlines on the part of the so-called progressives in Europe, or more generally in the Western world. While it has been conceded that it would not necessarily allow people from getting out of poverty, since providing a sufficient amount of income to live on would be too costly, nonetheless, it would be argued that a policy of nationwide minimum income, as started to be put into practice by the left coalition government in Spain and attempted to be reproduced in cases such as Italy or Portuguese, will be the only way forward. Whereas the opponents of this basic income schemes argued that it would make it all the more difficult for the working people to organize collectively, thereby widening the rifts between its different segments. Thereby, calls will be made for a post-pandemic world that would be contemplated as one in which people have access to work and the dignity it brings, an objective that requires job guarantee schemes that would ensure the right to work. If we go back to the Turkish case, it is interesting that IMF report also noted that direct fiscal support, including to workers and vulnerable households, has been relatively modest in the Turkish context. In other words, Turkey, along with Mexico, were among the G20 countries which provided the minimum amount of social support and public expenditure for the needy in the context of the deprivation caused and recession caused by the pandemic crisis. What has been, very briefly, if I could go over it, announced, note the terminology, the Stability Shield package by the Turkish government, tried to put forward sort of an arrangement which deferred loan repayments for artisans and shopkeepers for relatively short periods of time, first 3 months, later extended to 6 months, later again, all the way to the present, and postponed social security premium payments in selected sectors and expected their beloved credit guarantee fund limits from what it was previously. What they, in fact, ingeniously in their own way, introduced 2 more schemes. One was called short-term allowance payments, and the other one called workers on unpaid leave. These were, I deliberately refer to them as ingenious mechanisms because people who were put on those schemes would not be counted as people without jobs, as people without employment. So it is a peculiar aspect of the Turkish scene over the last 18 months. The number of unemployed do not rise. In fact, at times, if you believe the official statistics, go down. Because they are put into these, people who lose their jobs are put into those schemes. And what is more disturbing, for instance, for the workers who are put on so-called unpaid leave, earn, roughly speaking, less than $5 a day. And since minimum wage is on a monthly basis, calculated on a monthly basis in Turkish context, less than half of the Turkish minimum wage. So, and for the so-called short-term allowances, preferably more preferred from the point of view of the workers as such, allows people to earn something around just around the minimum wage. But the number of people who are given that opportunity, in a sense, tended to decline over time, and there will be increasing demands for enhancing the capacity or the framework for people to be shifted from identified as workers on unpaid leave to people who are provided the so-called short-term allowance payments. So what happens? People are forced to borrow, become debtors instead of earners, if you like. And in that respect, it was argued that nearly 1/5 of the Turkish population are put into this, if you like, framework to be characterized as permanent poor or the needy. It becomes the new version, if you like, of poverty management in the Turkish context. How am I doing time-wise?
Maybe 5 minutes more.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Now, of course, the constitutional framework, which had, how shall I say, put the increase the pressure upon, let alone the exercise of democratic rights and liberties, but expression of public opinion. The Turkish media under more or less complete control by the state, with certain exceptions to the rule, some newspapers and very few television channels, and of course the so-called social media. In that context, of course, there are a variety of attempts to protest as well as resist certain government implemented or supported projects which were detrimental, not only economically speaking, but also in terms of its destruction of the Turkish countryside and ecology. I mean, ecologically so-called crazy projects, this is the terminology of the president himself, are costing not only in terms of ecological destruction, but also in terms of generational destruction. And this will be considered as a way of proving that it is the state, in fact, the president, who calls the tune, so to speak. And in that respect, there are here or there in a variety of different geographical locations, attempts on the local people against these projects and tried to be put down these protests by the use of the Turkish security forces. But I would like to, that's why I asked how many minutes I'm left, remind us, our audience of a particular episode of resistance from a decade early. Shows, if you like, the characteristic ways in which the Turkish state, even before this further shift to a much authoritarian form, tended to make use of what could be considered its own distinctive feature of labor containment strategy. Because the privatization, which was propelled in the first decade of the 21st century by the AKP government, tended to make people lose their, not only their jobs, but social security advantages as the employees of former state economic enterprises. So there was, if you like, a moment of collective will formation in response to a particular process of privatization by the Turkish monopoly of alcoholic beverages and tobacco, which led thousands of people come to occupy the important sort of pedestrian location in central Ankara in the winter of 2009 and 2010, which was hailed as the reawakening of the Turkish working class, etc., created a lot of interest and, of course, a very strong reaction on the part of the government. But the thing is, it also showed that the way in which a particular authoritarian state tried to suppress any form of resistance should be considered important, because it also, how shall I say, I underlined that it had no, how shall I say, allowance for any form of challenge that would undermine its domination. So it will be increasingly identified as a challenge in that sense, to the extent that this authoritarian state was at the same time pursuing a neoliberal transformation strategy, a challenge to to AKP's version of neoliberal hegemony, but at the same time it would mean a crisis of organized working class, a crisis of trade unionism. Interestingly, at the beginning of the pandemic, a decade later, a foreign bank operating in Turkey would argue that to deal with the crisis, it is essentially necessary to erode the bargaining power of the workers. Whereas in Turkey, this wouldn't be a problem because union power is minimal. So this is the context in which precariousness and increasing unemployment, although in a sense shielded under these schemes I referred to, would lead to more critical observers to hope that it will constitute a unifying potential for the fragmented working people. Whereas the research we have done with colleagues some years ago showed that there are considerable constraints for initiating and mobilizing a collective struggle, because such resistance would be better to be understood in Gramscian's terminology as examples of economic corporate movement. In other words, they are simply resisting against the loss of their social security as such, because they will be, in a sense, deprived of their already earned right to social security. Hence, they will be describing themselves as victims of privatization, thus acknowledging, in fact, their powerlessness in the context of precarity and pauperization. Therefore, I think it is plausible to say that in the context of the present, as these debates take place, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, about the future of capitalism, and generally speaking, from the United States to different parts of the globe, various forms of resistance and protests from Black Lives Matter onwards, and even previously in the context of countries such as France with these yellow jackets, etc., there is a need, I think, to think in terms of what is to be done, how to really challenge the way in which the working people, or more generally for different segments of the society, being made to pay the cost of the crisis. Because it is, as it is the case at the moment, there is yet to emerge, intellectually speaking, a paradigmatic shift about the ways in which capitalist social orders could be contemplated so as to provide the theoretical underpinnings for political strategies, especially if you are concerned in terms of transforming capitalism, let alone on the part of those who would be interested in doing capitalism differently, as they put it. For the countries of the global north, there has been, as it has been the case, especially with the coming to power of Joe Biden in the United States, the shift from inflation fighting to coping with deflationary outcome of the pandemic would not necessarily imply a paradigm change, many argued, but rather a change in economic policy priorities. So, for those who would consider the crisis as an opportunity to do capitalism differently, the role of the state, in their view, should not be limited with crisis management. While this has resonances with the post-Second World War notion of the state as a extra market coordinating agency, it is also the case that for many now, what is required, quote, a mission-oriented approach to policymaking, so that the stimulus packages, etc., with the help of these measures, again, the terminology is quite familiar, but underlined once again, that the state could and should shape and create markets so as to deliver sustainable and inclusive growth. A notion reproduced interestingly by the IMF itself, by its new director. So there should be what they call an inclusive capitalism. By contrast, and as I'm coming to an end, there will be also those critical political economists, critical financial analysts, as they call themselves, already a new policy paradigm emerging, which posits that the development goals can be achieved by placing global finance at the center of the development processes. They dub it as the Wall Street consensus, resonating with the so-called Washington consensus, where fiscal discipline, central bank independence, and privatization will be given priority. Whereas the distinguishing feature of the so-called Wall Street consensus will be the introduction of mechanisms that allow global institutional investors to become critical actors in international development. So, by way of conclusion, we could ponder collectively, if you like, whether it will be plausible to suggest that the pandemic-initiated crisis would be qualitatively different in contrast to the previous financial crisis, that they would not function as the main driving forces to ensure further neoliberal transformation and financialization. Alternatively, it might be worth pondering whether the current systemic crisis provide an opening for the ways in which an alternative strategy of counter-hegemony could be developed, given the different forms of resistance in several countries around the globe before and during the pandemic. Thank you for your patience.